An early incident report from North Carolina tells us that voters trying to cast their ballots were dealing with harassment at the polls and intimidation, which I'll remind you is a crime. So there were 14 incidents of voter intimidation. They were reported across various counties in North Carolina on election day. The chart provided by the North Carolina State Election Board shows the various incidents they're investigating right now regarding election interference. In Columbus County, election officials, not voters, were involved in the two incidences. The NCSBE states the incidents in question involved an observer following one-stop workers in their car, photographing or filming the workers. In New Hanover County, the two incidents included electioneer harassing students walking to class at a one-stop site, an observer angrily confronting an election official. Curbside voters in Wake say they were photographed while waiting to cast ballots. In Harnett County, there were also reports of voters being videotaped. So the Department of Justice announced that they are monitoring that situation. And these types of actions aren't just wrong. Like I mentioned earlier, they could lead to criminal charges. So let's get into that. State and federal laws forbid intimidation or interference with the right of a voter to participate in an election, which includes hindering access to the voting place, whether inside or outside the buffer zone. The law also makes it a crime to interfere with election officials carrying out their duties. Penalties for violations include prison time, a fine, or both, according to the NCSBE. What's scary about this is a lot of what they were doing seems to be documenting who was at the polls. Maybe they were listening in on conversations, people talking about who they were excited to cast a ballot for. The fact that they were taking photos and filming people who were there suggests that some kind of follow-up is coming, that they wanted to remember what this person looked like. They were not just recording, oh, look who's out to vote today and do their civic duty. It really doesn't have that kind of a vibe. And we know that people were trained up as election volunteers throughout the country with this idea that voter fraud was going to happen. They very clearly don't want to live in a country where people are decided to be elected to represent them in public office based on the popular vote. We know that Republicans are comprehensively voting against expanding voting rights. Voting is very difficult for many people in this country still today. It's a work in progress. And Republicans are actively working against that progress and repealing a lot of the progress that we've made, a lot of the legislation that's been passed, and actively voting against the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So they want to make it more difficult for people to vote legally, but also they're willing to show up and intimidate people who are exercising their hard fought for rights, which is just disgusting. So hopefully they find the people who are doing this. But Dina, I want to get your thoughts on this because I know you have a background in law and this is a crime.
Yes, it's a crime and it should absolutely be enforced and really to the maximum extent to the law, because taking away somebody's right to vote through intimidation, which is essentially what the law is trying to prevent, is so important. I mean, we've seen people who got mistakenly voted when they weren't allowed to vote. I mean, in Arizona, I think somebody was sentenced to like 10 or 20 years for that. So this voter intimidation, I think, should be sentenced to something as high as that, because you're basically taking away someone's right to vote. How is that any worse than somebody voting twice? Both of them are wrong and they should both be prosecuted wrong. And this is why it's so important to volunteer. Right? We talked about how important it is to vote, but to volunteer. The Democratic Party recruits thousands of volunteers to go and be poll watchers. And a lot of them are outside trying to observe exactly that. So if somebody is looking like they are intimidating, the voter standing in line doesn't have to be by themselves dealing with the issue, but that volunteer can call law enforcement themselves and have somebody come. And so, the next time an election comes, reach out, be willing, spend a few hours on one of the voting days, showing up at your poll and just kind of see if anything happens. Because unfortunately, we saw a lot more intimidation. We saw a lot more kind of like law enforcement show up trying to do that, which sometimes can be intimidating itself. But if we have a lot of volunteers who want to actually just have ensure safe voting, that can combat this kind of fringe element who's trying to essentially scare people into not voting.
Yeah, and I think it's the kind of thing where, yes, the intimidation is going to impact the people who are directly there at the polls that day. But if it's widespread knowledge that this kind of thing is happening at polling locations, imagine the impact on turnout for people who feel vulnerable, who don't feel safe showing up to the polls, who plan to cast their ballot on election day. Like, the impact is more broad than just the people who were there at that point in time. You're making more and more voters afraid to vote, which is already a difficult thing to do in this country as many people are working. It's a complicated process. And so many people are disenfranchised, and now it's becoming worse because people are actively working against democracy at this point in time.